decline further, placing further strain on the most vulnerable population. These external headwinds come on top of longer-standing vulnerabilities, high debt levels that constrain the ability of many countries to finance essential services and development priorities. While inflationary pressures have moderated at the regional level, quite a number of countries continue to grapple with elevated inflation, necessitating tighter monetary policy stance and careful fiscal policy. Against this challenging backdrop, our report underscores the importance of calibrating policies to balance growth, social development, and macroeconomic stability. Building robust fiscal and external buffers is more important than ever, underpinned by credibility and consistency in policy making. In particular, there is a premium on policies to strengthen resilience, mobilize domestic revenue, improve spending efficiency, and strengthen public finance management and fiscal framework, and fiscal frameworks to lower borrowing costs. Reforms that enhance growth, improve business climate, and foster regional integration are also needed to lay the groundwork for private sector-led growth. High growth is imperative to engender the millions of jobs that our region needs. A strong, stable, and prosperous Africa is important for its people, but also for the world. It is the region that will be the main source of labor and incremental investment and consumption demand in the decades to come. External support, as the region goes through its demographic transition, is of tremendous strategic importance for the future of our planet. The fund is doing its part to help, having dispersed over $65 billion since 2020 and more than $8 billion just over the last year. Our policy advice and capacity development efforts support more countries still. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Abe. Before we turn to you for your questions, a couple ground rules. Please, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. We'll come to you, identify yourself and your organization, and please limit it to one question. For those online, you can use the chat function, or you can also raise your hand, and then we'll come to you. I will start from my right, lady in the white, Kemi.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. Thank you for taking my question. You mentioned several things in your report on the recovery that is going on the continent, as well as some of the challenges that the continent is facing and the dividends that the continent currently have in its youth. Leaders on the continent, I'm sorry, my voice allergies. Leaders on the continent are working. I was at an event yesterday where they are looking at ways to raise funds to develop projects. So what is your recommendation for projects? We're seeing need for projects like this, as well as revenue mobilization on the continent. So your recommendation to leaders on the continent on how to source these funds that is needed, given that some of the advanced economic are cutting back.
All right. Any related question before we go to Abe? Okay, Abe,
Thank you, Kemi.
Okay, sure. Gentleman in the black, Echo.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Echo Moses Danto. I report for Bloomberg. I'm a focus on Africa. Abebe, you just made a point that the recovery has been hit by these uncertainties. Beyond just policy directions, is there any scope to do anything in terms of, for example, maybe you disburse some money though, but maybe a little more to expect to countries that are coming off defaults and what have you, to help in this recovery, even at such a time? This is also aided by, beyond the fact that some are coming, they have no buffers whatsoever, and then coming from defaults, things become very difficult for some of these countries to even have the money to do this. So could there be any extra funding, even if at regional level, to back the policy prescriptions that you have proposed?
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, I
I think there's two different points here. I think the first one is more of a broader meta point, whether financing is the only constraint that's hindering more investment, more robust economic activity and job creation. Of course, financing plays a role, but it's not the only constraint. I think, again, it depends on country-to-country circumstances, what sectors we're talking about, but it really is important to recognize that there are many other things that can be done to engender higher growth, to facilitate more investment. You know, one of the issues that we've seen in our region over the years is that a lot of growth has been in many countries. Growth has been driven by public spending, public investment for many years. That, of course, has made major contribution. It has facilitated all the investment that we've seen in infrastructure, building schools, building clinics. So that has a role to play. But I would say that going forward, it will be as important to see if we can find ways in which the private sector is the main engine of growth. So there are reforms that can be done to facilitate this growth. The second one I'm sensing from both your questions is about the particular circumstance right now where combination of cuts in aid, tighter financing conditions are causing dislocation, are causing particular difficulties for governments. I think here, you know, we've been, I think, more than anybody else, stressing just what a difficult environment our governments have been facing. We've been talking about brutal funding squeeze that countries are under. It has a little bit ebbed and flowed, you know, like for external market conditions, for example. There have been periods when they've been opened and some of our market access countries have been able to borrow, and then other periods where they've been closed, and we're going through one right now. And this is on top of the cuts in aid that we've seen and tighter domestic financing conditions. When, you know, this more cyclical point is playing out, I think it's important for countries to be a bit more measured in how they're seeking to tackle their development needs. And you know, so maybe it means a bit more relying on domestic revenue mobilization, expenditure prioritization when conditions are particularly difficult as they are now. And as I said earlier, going back to see what can be done to find ways to engender growth over the medium term. But it is a difficult period, as we note in our report, and one that is causing quite a bit of dislocation to our countries.
All right, thanks, Abe. I'll come to the middle. Lady in the front, Nancy.
Thank you, Kwabena and Abe. My first question is around recovery slipping. Of course, your reports are called interrupted. So with recovery slipping, growth downgraded, debt pressures mounting, is Sub-Saharan Africa at risk of another lost decade? Because in your report, you did mention that the last 4 years has been quite turbulent for Africa, and we're trying to get back on track. What is IMF's message on bold actions that leaders must take now to avoid being left behind in the global economy and to avoid Africa being in a permanent state of vulnerability? Because we always hear we're in a permanent state of vulnerability, only God knows when that will end. Then for Nigeria, macros are under threat right now. How can the government, what are your suggestions on how the government can actually push through deep reforms that deliver tangible growth for its people? Of course, for your report, you did mention the millions and millions of people that live below $2.15 a day. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any more Nigeria questions? Okay, we'll take the gentleman right here. We'll take a few.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Desmond Okon. I represent Cable News from Nigeria, of course. So in your report, you said that debt has stabilized. And so, but when you look at Nigeria's debt profile, what insights can you share as to where the borrowings are going to? Are you seeing more of long-term loans or short-term loans. So that's one. Recently the World Bank expressed concerns about the performance of Nigeria's statistical body, saying that the institution is performing suboptimally. Do you share in that sentiment? Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I'll take one more on Nigeria. Gentleman in the first row.
My name is 𝐒𝐩𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠, I work for Vanguard. I'd like to know, in specific terms, Nigeria has already undertaken several reforms, especially removing oil subsidy and floating the naira. What more specific things do you expect of Nigeria in terms of reform? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Abe?
Thank you. In terms of the reforms that have been going on in Nigeria and the particularities of the challenge, first thing to note is that, we've been really impressed by how much reforms have been undertaken in recent years, most notably trying to go to the heart of the cause of the macroeconomic imbalances in Nigeria, which, of course, are related to the fact that, oil subsidies were taking up a very large share of the limited tax revenues that the government have and not necessarily being used in the most effective way to help the most vulnerable people. The issues related to the imbalances in the external side with the exchange rate extremely out of line. So it's been really good to see the government taking these on head on, address those, and also beginning to roll out the third component of the reforms that we've been advocating for, and of course, the government has been pursuing, which is to expand social protection, to target generalized subsidies and to help the most vulnerable. This has all been very good to see. But more can be done, particularly on the latter front, expanding social protection, and also enhancing a lot more transparency in the oil sector so that the removal of subsidies does translate into flow of revenue into the government budget. I think so. There's still a bit more work to do in these areas. We just had a mission in Nigeria where there was extensive discussions on these and other issues in the macroeconomic area, but also other areas where there is a need to do reforms to engender more private sector investment, and also how more resources can be devoted to help Nigeria generate the revenues it so desperately needs to build more schools, more universities, and of course more infrastructure. So there's a comprehensive set of reforms that Nigeria can pursue that would help engender more growth and help diversify the economy away from reliance on oil. And this diversification is, of course, all the more important given what we're seeing happening to commodity prices. So I think this is an important agenda. Second, as government is doing this, of course, there will be a financing need. And, here what's needed is really a judicious and agile way of dealing with the financing challenges the country faces. In the long run, the financing gap can only be filled by, permanent sources, such as revenue mobilization. But in the interim, carefully looking at all of the options the country has to borrow in a contained way will be part of that solution. And I think the government has been going about this prudently and cautiously so far, and we're encouraged by that. And then lastly, on data issues in Nigeria, I mean, we really applaud the effort the government's making to try and revise, upgrade data quality in Nigeria. This task is not an easy one in our countries, given the extent of informality there is, given the extent of relative price changes that play out in our economies. So doing this cautiously is what's needed, methodically, and that's exactly what we're seeing happening. And we welcome though the efforts the government's making, because without good data, it's difficult to make good policies. So we really applaud the effort the government's making to try and upgrade data quality. Thank you.
All right, we'll take a round of questions online. We go to Abi. There we go. Sorry, we can't hear Abi. Abi, if you can hear us, please state your name, your media house, and then your question.
Thank you so much. My name is Kenya, but on that, I have two quick questions. My first question is in regard to Ethiopia.
Like we haven't some Abi, we'll come back to you. Maybe we will come back to Abi. We'll try and resolve that. Maybe we'll go to Rachel online.
Hi there, Rachel Savage from The Guardian. I'd like to ask, there are bills in the UK Parliament and the New York State Assembly that aim to force holdout private creditors to accept debt treatments on comparable terms to other creditors and to, limit or stop such litigation. Are these bills needed, do you think, or is the current international debt architecture sufficient? So, IMF DSAs, creditor groups, the common framework where applicable. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Rachel. We go to RGB online.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead with your question.
Okay. Earlier this month, the IMF reached a staff-level agreement with Burkina Faso to complete the third review of the country's program. So, as part of the review, the IMF allowed a greater fiscal flexibility, allowing Burkina Faso to raise its public deficit target to 4%, up from the 3% cap set by the West African Economic Monetary Union. So given that the country's challenge, such as persistent insecurity, high social demands, are common across the region, wouldn't it be wiser to consider applying this flexibility more broadly to the West African Economic Monetary Union? And my second question will be about the downward revision of the growth forecasts for 2025 and 2026 in Sub-Saharan Africa. Does the IMF view this new crisis, I'm talking about the global uncertainty and the recent US tariff measures, does the IMF view this crisis as potentially more severe and with broader consequences for the region than previous shocks such as COVID and the war in Ukraine? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Abe, if you could take these ones. Yeah.
Thank you. On the first question on on debt workouts and the challenges there, I'm not fully informed about the specifics of the bills that Rachel, you're talking about. But indeed, we have seen from time to time some private creditor groups holding out, trying to hold out. But I'm not sure that a bill is what's needed, but rather, force of argument to try and bring people to the table. And in recent restructurings, at least, I'm not aware of this being the main hindrance in advancing discussions. There have been many other factors, including just the complexity of the current creditor landscape that have played a role. On Burkina flexibility under the program or the deficit targets for the 𝐒𝐲𝐬 countries more generally, I think just it's important to distinguish between a particular year's fiscal deficit targets that the government wants to pursue and we incorporate in the program, and just the more medium-term criteria, convergence criteria that there is for the 𝐒𝐲𝐬 countries. So the 3% target criteria is for the medium to long term, and it's been very clear that when there are shocks or when there are pressing social development needs, countries do have the scope to deviate from that. In fact, often the constraint in particularly the Sahel countries has been not having enough financing to be able to meet these, to advance development objectives. The other constraint, of course, is that overall, the more you exceed this 3% target and add to the overall debt burden, the more you're going to have, you're likely to build up debt vulnerabilities. So, in the work that we do, with countries, whether it's Burkina or other WAMO countries, or indeed beyond. What we try and help with is, of course, to help countries strike this balance between addressing the immediate and pressing needs that they have, while avoiding medium-term debt sustainability problems. I think one is like just thinking about how to strike this balance, and then second, we put resources on the table, very cheap, to help countries, avoid, at least in the near term, more difficult financing difficulties. So for Burkina and others, it's really just about striking this balance. And on growth, whether this latest shock is as bad as for the region as the previous ones, I think really important also to point out that as difficult, the last 4 or 5 years have been an incredibly difficult time for our countries, a lot of challenges, a lot of dislocation, but there's also been quite a lot of resilience. And I think that's important to stress. I would note in particular that, even now, I think it's this year, 11 out of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world are from Sub-Saharan Africa. So there are quite a lot of countries that are going to be sustaining significant growth in the region. So I think, we should also not lose sight of this resilience. Second, and more broadly, the build-up of uncertainties, I think, is very negative and is interrupting what we were seeing in terms of a recovery. But growth is not, we're not projecting growth to collapse, and our hope is that, as things calm down, the region can resume its growth trajectory also.
All right, thanks, Abe. We'll take 3 more questions online, then we'll come back to the room, please. I see Matt or Hillary. Hillary, please.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. I wanted to know about the situation in
Senegal. Sorry, please state your name and your media organization. Yeah.
Excuse me. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. I wanted to know on the situation of Senegal, what the thinking will go into in terms of whether funds would be repaid after the misreporting of data, if the IMF has learned anything from that. And also, just if you can, the status of the IMF's programs and even operations in Sudan and South Sudan. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks. We'll go to Hillary. If not, we can see whether Abby.
Sorry.
Yeah. Hillary,
my apologies. My apologies. I can't seem to turn on my camera for some reason. May I ask my question
please
anyway?
Go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes. This is Hillary Jaffe here from Business Day in Johannesburg. The IMF is urging countries to focus on domestic revenue mobilization, but you may have seen, I think, that South Africa's finance minister has withdrawn the VAT increase that he had proposed in the budget in the face of opposition from coalition partners. Does the IMF see any alternative sources of revenue that are feasible for the South African government as the parties hope? And are there any lessons here for other countries trying to mobilize domestic revenue? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Abe, let's take one more, Rama, and then we can come back to the room.
Sure. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you, Rama.
All right, perfect. Just building on the question that Hillary has asked there, the REO does make the case for revenue-led consolidation, and you made that argument, I believe, in the last 2 regional economic outlook reports as well. But, poverty is still pretty endemic. Incomes, as far as I can tell, haven't really recovered to pre-pandemic levels. So other than broad cuts to tax exemptions, what else can be done to raise tax to GDP ratios? One last question on this. Has there any progress that has been made in the sovereign debt roundtable in deciding how debt from Afrexim Bank and Trade and Development Bank should be treated, at least under the common framework for countries like Ghana and Zambia? Do they qualify to not have their debt restructured in the same way that the IMF, the World Bank's credit lines are not?
All right.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Abe?
Thank you. On Senegal, I was recently in Dakar for discussions building on work that our team has been doing. Where things are is that we're waiting for the government to finalize the work that's ongoing right now, the audits that are going, the review that's going on, and reconciliation work that's going on the extent of domestic and external debt. We have been very, very clear in welcoming the transparency and really robust and collegial way in which the government has been engaging on the issues that have arisen in the misreporting case, and look forward to the numbers stabilizing and engaging in discussions on the next steps in terms of bringing the findings to our executive board and next steps in our engagement with Senegal. On South Sudan, it's just been a really difficult period, of course, for South Sudan. They've been hosting, hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing from the conflict in the north. The conflict has also disrupted heavily their main source of tax revenue, oil exports through the pipeline. So it's been a really wrenching period. Over the last 3-4 years, we've provided, we've been trying to provide South Sudan with emergency financing and trying to find a way in which we can engage with a more structured, longer-term program. We remain hopeful that we are going to be able to do that. But first and foremost, I think we need to see what can be done to make sure that the policy-making environment is as robust and as strong as it is, and as transparent, so we can step in and support South Sudan. On revenue mobilization, I want to just first link this to the point I made earlier, that what we've observed, and again, there is a risk of generalizing, but what we've observed over the last 10-15 years in the region is that governments have made a very significant effort to invest in really important infrastructure needs, in building schools, in building health clinics, and much else. And you see very positive outcomes. Look at the electricity coverage in our region, look at the human development indicators and how much they've moved over the years in the region. But we've also seen that, despite a lot of investment, for example, in electricity generation capacity, electricity coverage in our countries, many roads being built, the returns of all of this investment have not been captured in the tax revenue, which is one of the points, with the pressure points where debt levels have gone up, and the interest to revenue ratio, so interest payment to revenue ratio has also been rising, and this has been one of the key points of vulnerability in many economies, and why a few countries have gotten into debt difficulty and needed to restructure. So going forward, I think it's very clear that to be able to continue investing, to be able to continue expanding economies, and the government doing its core function, it has to find more ways other than borrowing to address this. Now, in the past, governments have been quick to go to cut spending. And that has, we found again and again, to be very detrimental to development progress and growth outcomes. I think this, again, at the risk of generalizing, was the approach that was generally pursued in the 1980s and found to be very problematic, very challenging, very depressing to growth. So we very much would love for countries to avoid this. And when there are pressing spending needs, there's generally only a couple of ways that you can finance this. Spending cuts or revenue mobilization. You can borrow, of course, but as I said, borrowing is not optimal. Now, this doesn't mean revenue mobilization is easy. Far, far from it. It requires not only political engagement, but also a lot of communication, a lot of an effort to show that the resources the government is trying to generate are going to be going to the right areas to help, to strengthening the social contract. So it's a really deep and engaged process, and we're very, very cognizant of that. But I do think that this is the most optimal way, the most economically sensible way in which our countries can help address the tremendous development needs that we have. Now, specifically on South Africa, again, I think, ultimately when issues like this arise, these are deeply domestic political issues to be resolved as to what the best way to do the financing is. So if a tax rate increase for a particular tax is not possible, then maybe, finding ways to expand the tax base, maybe trying different tax handles, or if all of those are not possible, then revisiting spending priorities may be one of the ways that countries have to handle this. And this is typically what we see playing out in countries in the region when financing constraints are binding. So again, whether it's in Kenya, South Africa, or other countries, the issue of revenue mobilization is a live one, but one that's extremely complex. We're very cognizant of that, and one that requires quite a lot of consensus building, quite a lot of discussion to be able to advance, and of course, broader societal support. And we absolutely see countries engaging in this and do what we can to help bring lessons from other countries where we are asked to. Then there was a question about the GSDR, so this Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. This is the initiative launched by the fund and the bank to try and bring creditors and debtors together around the table to find ways in which debt workouts can be easier because you're discussing general principles rather than country-specific debt restructuring issues. And we have seen this making quite a lot of progress. Perhaps the most recent development has been the preparation of a debt workout playbook. That's, I think, a very helpful document that's been put out, building on the experience of recent workouts, what has worked particularly well, what kind of information sharing ahead of potential debt workouts have been helpful in terms of accelerating debt processes. Debt restructurings are one of the most contentious and challenging issues that there are between states, between creditors and debtors, and it requires quite a lot of discussion, and it's not such an easy thing to do, including what the parameter of debt should be. I think one of the questions that was raised is about the debt parameter. This is fundamentally an issue for the debtor countries and creditors to resolve, and intra-creditor disputes also that have to be done. In terms of the principles that generally we see creditors apply when these kind of disputes arise about what the right parameter should be or not and who gets preferential treatment, I think there's generally been two rules of thumb. One is that the terms in which new financing is being provided or the financing is provided, whether it's commercial or concessional, has been a factor that most creditors look at in terms of whether a particular credit should be included in the parameter or not, and then also the extent to which new financing is being made available. So what differentiates senior creditors like the IMF, the World Bank, of course, is that for most countries we are providing concessional financing, very long term, and also we're the ones that come in and provide financing consistently through crisis and otherwise.
All right, thanks, Abi. We have time for one round of questions. I'll start with the gentleman in the front here.
Thank you very much. Julian Piquet with 𝐒𝐲𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 in the Africa Report. Julian Piquet, 𝐒𝐲𝐫𝐬𝐧𝐠, the Africa Report. So the U.S. is your largest shareholder, and we're seeing, mixed messages this week. The Treasury Secretary mentioning that he still remains committed to the fund, but also calling on you to, hold countries accountable to program performance, empower staff to walk away if reform commitment is lacking. So I wanted to ask you, should we expect the IMF spigot to start closing in response to U.S. pressure, or if not, are you changing your approach to countries, what you're telling them, and how to, to deal with their issues? Are you being a little more stringent in your requirements? You've talked about Senegal, maybe Ghana, Ethiopia. Related to that issue of the U.S. stepping in, CMAC negotiations this week. We saw American energy companies working with CMAC on repatriation of funds dedicated to the rehabilitation of oil sites. I'm wondering if you have a stance on that, what the IMF position is. I understand the U.S. is trying to get the IMF involved in that. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Gentleman there, in the blue shirts.
Yeah, Kefa Moirore, Nation Media Group out of Nairobi, Kenya. Kenyan authorities here have indicated the need to present a credible fiscal framework as they try and unlock a new program for Kenya. Would you offer more color into the discussions this week, noting again that the same credibility questions led to the cancellation or the termination of the program at its final review? Thank you.
All right, thanks. Abi, and then we have a question online from Abi, whom we couldn't get to. The question is, what's the IMF's view on Kenya's debt position? Thanks.
Thanks. So on the first question, I think I would like to refer you to Kristalina, who gave comprehensive responses to the Secretary's IMFC statement. What I want to add, though, is that in the region, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of programs, the calibration of reforms, the incorporation of reforms, I would say that I think. We are always, in terms of, each program has its particularities, and what we always try and do in these programs is make sure that we're striking a balance in helping countries address the long-term challenges and also the cyclical challenges that are often the ones that cause them to come to us. And I would say that, I don't think there are many countries that think that the adjustment efforts that they're being asked to do are easy ones. On CEMAC, just to be very clear, I mean, there is this dispute that's going on between member states, the BEAC, and oil companies with respect to what are called restitution funds, the funds that, under contracts that countries have with oil companies, are meant to be available to help restore the sites where oil is extracted back to their pre-extraction standards. What's been a bit frustrating is that we are not privy to the contents of these documents. Okay, we've been calling on members and the companies involved to be transparent about this, to publish these documents. They are, after all, documents that are about how countries' natural resource wealth are used. And we've been on record, going 7, 8, 9 years, pushing for production sharing agreements, the terms of these things to be published, so that each side can hold the other accountable. I think that's the first thing that could be done to bring more transparency and light and understanding, I feel, by the rest of the world about what's going on in these discussions. Second, we've also made it clear to both parties that given that we don't have full information, it's difficult for us to know what to say. But in general, any encumbrances, in terms of how we look at foreign exchange reserves, and these standards are published, any encumbrances like the type that we think there may be in the document, i.e. the expectation that these resources will be used for specific purposes, means they're not general use reserves. So they wouldn't be classified as part of reserves. On Kenya, Kenya, of course, is a very, we've had a very strong engagement in Kenya over the years and will continue to have such engagement going forward. As we've noted, the government has asked for a follow-on program to try and address the remaining challenges in Kenya, and we are discussing how to do that, including in the context of these meetings. It's been good to see that the economy has been performing quite well in some parts, particularly the external adjustment front seems to have been proceeding well. The current account has been narrowing, so there are quite a lot of strengths. But also, of course, there remain fiscal challenges, which were a significant part of the last program's objectives that need to be advanced. So we're going to engage with the government and do everything that we can to be in a position to help going forward.
All right. Thanks, Abe. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So if you have any questions that we didn't get to, please send them to me or to media@imf.org, and we'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. Also to mention that the report is now available at imf.org/Africa. The spring meetings continue. Later this morning, we have the press briefing for the European Department, and later in the afternoon, we have the IMFC and the Western Hemisphere Department press briefings. On behalf of Abebe and the African and Communications Departments, thank you all for coming to this press briefing, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.